Welcome back. Today we're going to take a quick look at the new planar from KZ. This one is the PRX. So those of you familiar with KZ's planars, they started out at PLA13, which was actually a CCA model. Then they went through a series of PRs, so PR1 through 3. And then there was a Symphony, which was kind of similar. But yeah, this one is called PRX. Those of you who have looked at this one online will sort of notice that mine is missing the blue stripe. I'm not sure if I got the factory reject or what happened to my blue stripe, but faceplate looks the same as the marketing listing, but the blue stripe is actually missing on mine. So on the back, you'll also notice that there is a couple new things, maybe a return of one old thing and kind of a new thing. So those of you who are familiar with, I think it was PR2 was the one with the mesh. So the mesh is back, that black strip that you can kind of see looks like a piece of tape. And also the driver appears to be wrapped in some kind of material that is blue as well. So a couple new things, and we'll talk about those in 1 second. But I just wanted to give you a quick look at what it looks like. Hopefully yours has a blue stripe because mine apparently does not. But we'll kind of jump into it and we'll talk about what KZ actually said about the upgrade from PRX or the difference between PRX and PR3. And we'll start with this. The dampening structure optimization significantly reduces sibilance and smoother listening experience. So I do think, and I'll at least give you my opinion on what the mesh did or what the tape did and why it is back and why it's important. And going back to that set, I'm pretty sure it was PR2. So I don't think it was ever meant to be a tuning material. I don't think it changes the frequency response. It was actually there to absorb reflections. And KZ sets tend to get a lot, noisier in the upper treble. Those of you who have really extended sources and have tried some previous KZ sets, if you watch my reviews, I've actually complained about this quite a bit. They have some sets that they put some very light material on it. About a year ago, they switched from this tuning style that was more electronic and less dampening material. And in the process of doing that, they tried to compensate and remove some noise with the nozzle material. And that kind of works up until a point, and I definitely complained about more than a few sets for that reason was, that the electronic tuning works pretty much, like 95%, but then there's a 5% that was just a little bit too noisy, where in the 15K, 13 to 15K, and it kind of comes across in some of their sets. So the previous planars actually had the same exact problem. And I think that material that you see, that black tape, was essentially part of removing a lot of that extra noise and making the treble a lot quieter. And I think the blue material around the driver itself is probably doing the exact same thing. It's all about quieting some of these vibrations and reflections and a lot of the extra noise that came across in the extra or in the previous planar set. So yes, I definitely think this set was done right. It's done correctly, and it sounds very different in the upper treble for that particular reason. So I think they use the word sibilance, and I will say that is what I would call the upper treble noise. I think we're talking about the same thing. I think KZ knew about that problem. And when they removed it, the tape in PR2, and they said, well, the tuning is the same. That's why I said, I don't think that mesh was actually there for tuning in as much as it was there to remove some extra noise. So a return to that and kind of sealing and dampening the actual internal structure of the driver, which is what that blue thing looks like it's probably doing. I think those are two things that are going to make this a very cleaner sounding planar compared to any of the previous KZ planars. So I do kind of agree with number one. And number two, I think the acoustic curve optimization, they're talking about the tuning is actually different, delivers a more expansive and natural sound stage, and we'll kind of talk about that as well. And then there was this magnetic circuit enhancement driver, increase the density, and it's something that some words that they've used before. I'm not sure if that actually came across in this particular set as much as where they started talking about it. So that number three kind of goes back to the original complaints on planar drivers where they didn't do bass as well as dynamic drivers, and there's always going to be a little difference. And KZ has always talked about this density where they had a density measurement and said planars are just as dense as dynamic drivers. So it's kind of a marketing point and something they like to talk about. But in here, it's a little bit harder. So I don't necessarily talk about that as much as the first two. And the tuning, we'll take a look at what really changed in PR3. And you can kind of see where PR3 was kind of way up there in treble. There was there was a lot of noise out here. This was a very bright sounding planar set. This one was really not that much different than PR2 and PR1. They were all essentially bright sets. There were some unit variations, and there were some sets that had lower treble, but I think PRX is probably going to be the one that is going to consistently look like this lower treble. This treble level isn't all that far from S12. It's not all that far from the S12 2024. These are levels that are under the Harman target. These are levels that are going to be more comfortable for more people. And I 100% agree with lowering the treble on planar sets is absolutely necessary. And that kind of gets you to the point where they sound a lot more natural. I think technically wise, I think PR1 through PR3, technically were all sounded great. You get a large amount of detail. They were very resolving. They were just like planar sets as you would expect them to be. But as far as being natural and easy to listen to, they were not, because they had so much treble. So when you bring that down, now you're getting the right balance of detail and resolve and resolution with a set that sounds a lot more natural. And again, bringing the treble down is going to give you a better sound stage. So again, I agree with that second point, whereas this new style of tuning with the proper amount of bass here and a lowered treble and no shout here, those things are going to give you a better stage experience, and they are with PRX. So yeah, I agree with their second marketing point as well. So we'll kind of jump into the rest of the things on PRX. And if you've listened to any of my planar reviews, they all kind of go similarly. A lot of the planar drivers are very similar. They all are very resolving, very technical, very detailed. Pretty much all the planar drivers that are in use today all have these characteristics that carry through no matter what they are. The tuning tends to vary, and some are more natural than others. Some are better at bringing that across than others. So, this will be part review, part kind of a rehash of what some of those capabilities on planar drivers are and how they come across on PRX. So, is PRX the one? Is this the one KZ planar that you should own? And the answer is yes. There's no need to look at the other KZ planars. If you have PR1 through 3, should you upgrade to X? And I would say yes. And I don't say that all that often. But this one, with the new treble tuning, I think a lot of people who bought PR1 through 3 ended up EQing it. And the EQ would look probably a lot like PRX. So yes, if you have those and you weren't EQing, it's probably worth going to PRX because it is the one that is tuned properly and as a planar should be. So if you have S12, should you upgrade? And the answer is probably no. That's still going to be a better driver. It's still going to be about twice as expensive, but still, the S12 is still the king of planars. So if you have that one, there's not really a need to pick up PRX. But is it better than the $70 planar drivers? This year there's been a lot of recent $70 to $69 planar drivers, the 13 millimeter planar drivers, and they all kind of pitch themselves as a cheaper alternative to S12. And I would say I didn't like most of them for the most part. I think PRX is actually closer to tuning and text to S12. If that's what you were buying those sets for, to be a cheaper alternative to S12, I think PRX is actually a better version of a cheaper version of S12 in that respect. If you were looking for something different from S12, then yes, I think those $70 sets were actually pretty good. They had different style tunings. This one is actually tuned closer to S12, and technically it sounds closer to S12. So I think this one is probably more in line with that cheaper S12 as opposed to some of the other ones that came out this year, which were kind of so-so. I didn't like most of them. So is it better than Hydro? And I think some people always prefer dynamic drivers and balanced armature. That configuration will always sound a little bit more natural, better in their ear. But I do think the smaller shell on this one and the smaller price will definitely appeal to more people. It's really hard to compare one planar driver to a set like Hydro. They aren't quite the same. But if you're just looking at something very specific, maybe. But would you have fear of missing out if you just owned PRX as opposed to Hydro? And I think no. I say the same thing every time. I will take planars well into mid hi-fi hybrid levels as they get around most of the problems of hybrids in that $100 to $200 level, even $300 level. Driver tuning problems, right? All those sets tend to have some kind of problem. So having a single driver with a very consistent tuning kind of gets around most of those problems. You don't have these dynamic drivers which are too slow. You don't have balanced armatures that sound, too off natural. They aren't peaky. One single driver gets around a lot of those problems. But as I said, I think some people were always going to be turned off by the size of Hydro. Hydro is a big set. It is a big shell, and I think that there is something to be said for people who just don't want to deal with something this big. I mean, it's a great set, but again, it's very large sitting in your ear. This is a much smaller set, a more manageable set to put in your ear. So I think people will gravitate to paying a little bit less money, a more comfortable experience simply on that, regardless of they don't necessarily sound the same. They're not tuned the same. But if you're looking for a very technical KZ, I think this one will probably fit the bill for most people. So what is the problem with this one? And this is kind of a problem that goes back to the original PR1. This is a return to the harder to drive planar style that they used originally. This one's about 94 decibels versus 98. It's noticeably harder to drive. And I think PR3 was probably maybe the easiest to drive at 98 dB. I don't remember what Symphony was, but KZ tried to slowly work their way into making their planars more sensitive and sensitive. They started out as hard to drive, and that was a big complaint. And then they kind of made them a little bit easier to drive. And then I think this is a return to some of the original style. And I would say you have to have a dongle or a phone that does about 100 milliwatts or above. I know you can probably work out the math, and it probably comes back down to 70 or so. But I tried a dongle. I had the blonde dongle, and it was about 160 on balance. And I was like, I could pretty much max out the dongle volume on some tracks. On some, it was fine. But I would say you're going to need something kind of beefy to drive this one. And again, this has been a consistent problem with KZ planars. It's a consistent problem with other planars. They are just harder to drive with just a phone. So I'll also say the other problem is volume scaling. Without a peaky, bright treble, this one really brought down the treble level and got rid of a lot of the peaks. The PRX will take you really to unhealthy volume levels, and it will sound better doing so. You can keep on turning this one up, and it goes up and up. And yeah, I definitely listened to it at a ton of volume, no different than I think S12. I said the same thing about it, but it is one of those sets, and that was similarly, it's deceptively detached from volume controls, and you'll keep on maxing out the volume even though you just turned it up about a minute before. Your brain adjusts to it very quickly, and without these peaks to remind you, or the shoutiness to remind you that as you're turning the volume up, it feels detached from that. Normally you turn up the volume and it becomes shouty or peaky or bright, and without that, like I said, it becomes kind of detached. You're just turning it up and everything is rising at basically the same rate from the bass all the way to the treble. You have this very linear rise. It's more presence as opposed to loudness or shoutiness or peakiness. Very detached. It's kind of a more top-of-the-line style thing that you hear on more expensive sets as opposed to budget sets. But yeah, this one is no doubt in that range of, you can keep on turning it up and up and up, and it sounds better and better. People who are listening to low volume, I probably wouldn't do it. I would keep on turning it up because a lot of it is just more about presence of the range as opposed to the peakiness and the shoutiness that you're going to expect to hear. So the sound, as I said, with S12 2024, planars are very good at handling all genres, vocal clarity, and in-the-room transparency. This one is no different. No different with PRX, just not as, probably not at the S12 24 level. Both sets need a super resolving, really nice extended sources and all that. But yeah, I think S12 2024, it's still the king of planars. It is still a pristine sound. It is crystal clear and pristine from end to end. This one, it's like 90% there. You kind of recognize the similarity in these characteristics of the vocal clarity and in that room, and being able to really play back a lot of those, in the room acoustics of people, what they sound like in the studio, being in the room with them. A lot of those things that dynamic drivers really aren't good at, or really planars are really good at really playing back those things. And if you have a really nice source, both of these sets are actually really good at that. And that's sort of why I like listening to planars. I think some people are really into timbre and are like flutes, sound like flutes. I love that feeling where it kind of, your brain kind of is tricked into thinking that that person is standing next to you, or you were really close in that studio with that person. And I think planars always do a better job at that. So that's a lot of the reason why I love planars. So whether it's PRX or S12, I just love the general category of planars because of a lot of it, even the vocal clarity. If you listen to lots of rap and hip hop, the vocal clarity is really important. And dynamic drivers are okay at it. They have that natural bit to it, but they don't get the articulation that you get with a planar, and how fast planars are and how resolving and detailed they can be. how the dynamics are on a planar. All of that is very different than dynamic drivers, and again, kind of why I love planar sets. So the bass, again, if you want to nitpick it, people always say dynamic drivers have kind of a more textured bass. Planars generally handle higher levels better with respect to the mids. And this one is no different. I think S12 is no different. You can definitely raise the volume on this one with EQ, or raise the level of bass on this one with EQ quite high to bass head levels, and the mids will still sound fine. It responds to EQ much better than dynamic drivers, and you can argue that dynamic drivers have better texture, but I'll say that the trick on planars is part of the texture problem with planars is they need more volume or EQ to bring out the depth and the resonance, and this set is sort of no different. I think you do need a little bit more volume, you do need some EQ to it, just until you hear that depth to that resonance that you usually hear on a planar, and it has that sound, that subwoofer enclosure sound to it. You just need a higher level, and I think KZ did a pretty decent job. They definitely didn't go light on it, but I think this is tuned for someone who doesn't necessarily listen to bass heavy sets, but to get into that real depth and rumble, and so it sounds like an enclosure or a subwoofer, you do need to just boost this up a little bit. And you're paying $50 for a planar set that is super technical and can do everything right. So do have some fun with this set, and do EQ it. Push the bass as high as you can comfortably listen to it. It is a very fun experience to hear a planar doing very high bass levels without distortion, without booming or bloat. All those things that planars are really, really good at. You should explore those things with your set. You bought it. Take the time to get to know what planars can do and what their capabilities are, and the bass, and kind of appreciate. I can appreciate the people who like dynamic drivers and love that sound. That is one thing, but I think even on the flip side, I think there are advantages to planar bass, and to explore those with a set that you just bought and a driver that is certainly capable of handling those levels, you should really take some time and have some fun with it. So the mids, unlike those dynamic driver and balanced armature hybrids, planars have that smaller range of tuning that sounds natural. And this one is no different, and exactly what I was complaining about on PR3, right? On planars, this treble level is almost everything. It's a difference between sounding super technical, analytical, but way off natural, and bringing the level down where, maybe you lose some of that raw resolve, but it sounds a lot more natural, and you don't have that planar timbre. So, pretty much everything happens better if you lower the level, and that's exactly what PRX does. That's exactly why PRX sounds better than any of the other PR sets. And again, I think on hybrids, you have a much wider range, and there's more tuning styles that actually sound more natural. On planars, we're sort of kind of zooming into, you've got the S12 kind of with this a little bit more treble and sounds a little bit more resolving. MP145, S08, they brought down the treble level, right? I think it's somewhere around here. I think those sets, the S12s and the PRXs, really good at techs. And the trick that gives you that S12 timeless PRX sound. The other sets that are, maybe trade some techs for warmth, like the MP145 and the S08, just a little bit more bass, a little bit more warm, kind of smooths over the techs a little bit, but they are kind of more appealing at the bottom end. And then PRX is kind of more up there with the S12 and the timeless style, where it's just a little bit more technical with a little bit more treble. And so speaking of treble, I think, again, like I was just talking about, most of the planar problems reside in the treble. Too much lower treble flattens the sound. Too much upper treble adds more planar timbre, more noise, all those things that we talked about. And again, I will say that this set, with the tape, the mesh, the blue covering, all these things were to give you better treble, more solid treble all the way out through the edge of extension. Exactly what happens on PRX, and it's done really, really well. It's quite different than the other sets in that respect. And I would say that the trifecta on planars is you have to have a little bit more bass, which sounds more natural, less planar, and that really adds depth to the stage. The lower upper mid, the lower treble, you have to remove that peaky, flattening planar sound. And planars can do really crazy extension but there's no boost needed. Otherwise, it sounds more planar, more sibilant. This was the PRX recipe for success, and kind of why I talked about those things. So, like I said, I would actually boost the bass and EQ a little bit if you can. That'll make it sound a little thicker bodied. it'll be certainly a lot more fun, but it's the body bit that's sort of a little bit light. Not really light, but I would say it sounds better with a little bit more body. They lowered this bit so it's not shouty. You don't get a lot of that thinness that happens when you turn up the volume. So the vocals aren't so bright and thin. They got that right. And then they got rid of all the extra boost out here for the most part. And again, that is going to sound a lot less planar timbre, more natural, less noisy, all the things that, I think they got the recipe for all the parts down right on PRX, as opposed to PR 1 through 3, which we're getting closer. There was kind of refinements, but PRX is probably the first one that actually nailed it. So stage, as I said, planar stage needs more bass, like they gave it, less treble, like they gave it, and this is exactly what you get with PRX. But do avoid sources that emphasize the upper mids, because that will flatten it out a bit. But your typical flat neutral reference style source will kind of play it as it is, and sort of it's that recipe for nice stage and exactly what you get on PRX. So that is what I got on PRX. Sorry that was a long one, but thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.